Imagine you're a Soviet pilot, trained in the best military academies of the Soviet Union, flying one of the most advanced fighter jets in the world. You receive an urgent alert. An American intruder is crossing Soviet airspace. You climb to maximum altitude, your engines roaring at the absolute limit of their capacity. You activate your missile systems, lock the target on radar, and prepare to fire. But then you look out the window and see something that makes your blood run cold. A black aircraft, sleek as a knife, is flying so high and so fast that it seems to defy the laws of physics. You push the throttle all the way forward, but the American plane simply disappears. It doesn't flee, it doesn't maneuver, it just accelerates, and within seconds it's miles away, climbing even higher, flying even faster, as if you weren't even there. You return to base in silence, knowing you've just witnessed something that will forever change your perception of who's really winning the Cold War. This was the SR-71 Blackbird, the aircraft that made the Soviet Union realize they weren't just behind the United States technologically, they were in another century. To understand why the SR-71 was such a devastating shock to the Soviets, we need to go back to May 1st, 1960. That day, the Soviet Union shot down an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Gary Powers. The Soviets captured Powers alive and displayed the wreckage of the aircraft in public. It was a massive international humiliation for the United States. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, practically laughed in the Americans' faces, saying that now the whole world knew that the United States was just a paper tiger. The Soviet Union celebrated as if they had proven their technological superiority. But what they didn't know was that at that very moment, in a secret facility in California, American engineers were already working on something that would make the U-2 look like a toy. Something that would prove definitively and undeniably how far ahead American technology really was. The answer came from a division of Lockheed called Skunk Works, led by legendary engineer Kelly Johnson. When the CIA challenged him to design an aircraft that couldn't be detected, intercepted, or shot down, Johnson became obsessed. The solution was radical. Create a plane that flew so high and so fast that conventional weapons simply couldn't reach it. But this created impossible challenges. At Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, air friction would generate temperatures hot enough to melt aluminum. The solution was titanium, but there was a problem. The United States didn't have enough titanium, so the CIA created shell companies and bought tons of titanium directly from the Soviet Union. The Soviets sold the material that would be used to build the plane that would spy on them for decades, without having the slightest idea. When the KGB discovered this years later, the embarrassment was absolute. A KGB memo stated, "We not only failed to prevent the construction of this aircraft, we actively helped build it. This is the greatest intelligence failure in Soviet history." The engines were another impossible challenge. Pratt & Whitney created the J-58, a revolutionary hybrid engine that became more efficient the faster it flew. This is completely counterintuitive, but the SR-71 was more economical at Mach 3 than at lower speeds. Even the fuel was special. JP-7 was so stable that you could drop a lit match into it and the match would simply go out. And the aircraft's design. On the ground, the Blackbird leaked fuel from its tanks. The panels didn't fit together perfectly, but this was intentional. At 500 degrees Fahrenheit at cruising speed, the titanium would expand and everything would seal perfectly. It was engineering that anticipated the extreme environment in which it would operate. Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence began receiving reports about this new aircraft, and the specifications seemed absurd. Speeds exceeding Mach 3, altitudes above 80,000 feet, titanium structure. The first reports were sent to Moscow with notes saying, "This seems like disinformation, recommend extreme skepticism." Soviet engineers were dismissive. They had just shot down the U-2. In their minds, this proved they were equal to the Americans. The idea that the United States was working on something so far beyond was cognitively difficult to accept. But when they finally obtained concrete evidence, the reaction in Moscow was panic. The MiG-25, their best interceptor, had a maximum speed of Mach 2.8 and a ceiling of 67,000 feet, still 15,000 feet below where the Blackbird operated. Analysis after analysis came to the same conclusion. The SR-71 was effectively invulnerable. When the Blackbird became operational in 1966, the Soviets had their first real chances to try to counter it. The attempts were almost comical. A Soviet pilot named Viktor Belenko, who later defected to the West, described the experience. He said that when he received the alert that a Blackbird was approaching, there was immediate frustration because every pilot knew it was futile. You would scramble anyway, climb to maximum in your MiG-25, and when you finally reached 60,000 or 65,000 feet, the Blackbird was still thousands of feet above and pulling away at a speed impossible to match. Belenko described it as psychologically devastating. You're flying one of the most advanced interceptors in the world, pushing to absolute limits, and the target is so far beyond that you can't even get close. The Soviets tried everything. S-75 missile operators, the same ones who shot down the U-2, fired at the Blackbird. But hitting a target at Mach 3 at that altitude was impossible. One of the SR-71's standard evasive maneuvers was simply to accelerate a little, from Mach 3.0 to Mach 3.2. That small increase was enough to make all the missiles miss. In 1981, over the Baltic Sea, Soviet commanders coordinated a massive response. Multiple missile batteries were alerted. Interceptors were scrambled from 3 different bases. Over 20 missiles were fired in a coordinated salvo. It was a wall of fire that the Blackbird would have to cross, and the Blackbird flew through it all without even changing course. The pilot later reported that they detected the launches, monitored the tracking, and determined they were not in real danger. The missiles simply couldn't reach them. The true scale of the technological gap became apparent when Soviet engineers obtained more information. A 1969 report from a Soviet research institute essentially said, "We have identified the titanium alloys used. We have determined approximate fabrication methods. However, we do not possess the industrial capacity to replicate. Estimated timeline, 8–10 years, assuming priority allocation of resources. 8 to 10 years just to start building something similar." The J-58 engine left Soviet engineers astonished. The variable geometry inlet system had no Soviet equivalent. The transition from turbojet to ramjet was something they had theorized but never implemented. A GRU report stated, "The Americans have operational today what we hope to have in 5 years. There was also the psychological dimension. When you know the enemy has a weapon you can't counter, it affects morale." Stories about the Black Plane spread throughout all Soviet air defense forces. Some pilots gave it nicknames. Some spoke of it with grudging respect. But underlying was the uncomfortable knowledge that there was something out there they couldn't defend against. Air defense was a source of Soviet national pride, but against the Blackbird, that pride was hollow. The SR-71 flew operational missions for over 30 years. During that time, more than 4,000 missiles were fired at it. Not a single one hit. This perfect record wasn't luck. It was superior technology, excellent training, and tactics that exploited the aircraft's capabilities. And the mere existence of the SR-71 forced the Soviets to divert massive resources to defensive programs that never worked. Every ruble spent trying to develop a counter to the Blackbird was a ruble they couldn't spend on their own priorities. Some SR-71 missions penetrated Soviet airspace, photographed sensitive installations, and returned without incident. The Soviets detected, tracked, and watched helplessly. Each time was a reminder of their vulnerability. The SR-71 retired in 1998, over 3 decades after its first operational flight. Not a single one was shot down by enemy fire. The aircraft still holds the official speed and altitude records for a manned jet aircraft. Those records were set in 1976 and still stand today, almost 50 years later. For the Soviet Union, the Blackbird was more than just an impressive aircraft. It was a symbol of American technological superiority that couldn't be denied. Each time that black shape appeared on Soviet radar screens, it was a reminder that in aerospace technology, the United States was generations ahead. The irony that much of the Blackbird was built with Soviet titanium only made the situation more bitter. The story of the SR-71 reveals something fundamental about the Cold War. For all the propaganda, technology doesn't lie. When one side builds something the other can't match, that's an objective demonstration of capability. The Blackbird proved which superpower was winning the technological race, and that lesson wasn't lost on Soviet leadership. The inability to counter the SR-71 contributed to a broader recognition that the Soviet Union was falling behind technologically. This realization eventually played a role in Gorbachev's reforms and ultimately in the collapse of the Soviet system. Obviously, one aircraft didn't cause the fall of the Soviet Union, but it was part of a larger pattern of American superiority that the Soviets couldn't match. This is the story of how American engineering created something so advanced that it changed the balance of the Cold War. This is the story of the SR-71 Blackbird, the plane that proved American superiority and did it with titanium the Soviets themselves provided. And this might be the most perfectly American story of the entire Cold War. If you found this story fascinating, there are dozens of other incredible Cold War stories waiting to be told. The spy satellites that could read license plates from space, the submarine operations that tapped Soviet underwater cables, the double agents who fooled both sides for decades. Which story should we cover next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Cold War history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the secret operations, technological marvels, and human drama that defined the most tense period in modern history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.